And even if you think of Germany, for example, as being kind of the third largest economy in the world, it's neck and neck with Japan right now. Germany is the economy that it has become because its manufacturing machine has largely become dependent upon China.
Right.
So it wouldn't be where it is right now if it wasn't for that symbiotic relationship in between its industrial base and the needs of its main customer, if you think about it that way. But on more on a geopolitical level, the IMF right now is involved in bailing out, I want to say 74 countries worldwide. And I get people who follow me closely know that if you call this the coronavirus recession, my fangs come out because it's not. It is a black swan economic event that exposed a lot of leverage.
Right.
And in many cases, a lot of these countries that are being bailed out by the IMF were aided and abetted in becoming as over-leveraged as they are via Chinese banks. And I doubt in a million years that China figured it was going to end this way, that they were going to be under a microscope in the year 2020 being told by world authorities to stand down and that they cannot collect on their debts because these countries are on their knees in many ways. So has the quiet colonization gone awry? And are we paying enough attention to this? Because this was a big part of their grand plan.
Right. Well, I mean, so bring the World Bank into it. I don't know if you remember, but World Bank basically signed up to in perpetuity giving them $1 billion, giving the Chinese $1 billion, because of just about every other international institution, the World Bank's been taken over by the Chinese. No, I don't think they were expecting this. That being said, you still have hundreds of billions of dollars making their way into China through the IPOs that are going on in Hong Kong. Xpeng just did a $1.5 billion IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, despite having stolen technology from Apple and Tesla. And then you've got the Chinese bond market is booming. So it's not just about the IMF. Wall Street, London, Berlin, they're all sending money to China, and that's what's kind of feeding this thing. So I don't think it's stopped quite yet, because the door hasn't shut yet. And that's really the thing. If this Belt and Road Initiative was to rely solely on the currency that the Chinese Communist Party could create, that I think does less than 2% of transactions globally,
correct.
Even today, that would fall apart in a heartbeat. What they need is hard currency, because hard currency gets them the raw materials and resources that allows them to continue on the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is our big problem. And it's one of those things where I keep saying, the first thing you do is you find yourself in the bottom of a hole is to stop digging.
Right. And yet, and we know the power and the lure of investment banking fees. But when you think about what's happened in Hong Kong and the situation and how it has evolved, why on earth would they even risk cutting off such an important international conduit to their own liquidity?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that they do find that at risk, because here you have a country where there's effectively been a one country, two system policy that clearly said, no, we're going to have one country, one system. We have said, State Department has said, you're no longer sufficiently autonomous. But yet, how has the Fed and the Treasury reacted? The Hong Kong Monetary Authority still produces a Hong Kong dollar, still exchanges it for the US dollar. So in effect, the Chinese Communist Party has two currencies. They have what is considered a freely exchangeable currency in the Hong Kong dollar. This is how they get hard currency. And then when it gets into the mainland, it's exchanged by the People's Bank of China for renminbi, and then the Communist Party takes their cut. The money goes wherever the Communist Party wants it to go. When you raise money on the New York Stock Exchange, it goes to that company. If a Chinese company raises money on the New York Stock Exchange, it goes to the People's Bank of China. Who controls the People's Bank of China?
Right. So that kind of brings me to where Chinese authorities want to go next. Right now, there are very few options. The provinces inside the country are very weak still. It is just the big three exporting monsters that are doing well. The same way we talk about there being a K-shaped recovery here in the United States, there's an equal K-shaped recovery in China right now. And they've got a serious issue with unemployment that we, of course, don't know about, but we do know about it. What they're doing is going back to their very old playbook. They're pouring money into infrastructure spending. They finally stopped buying copper, but they've been buying up iron ore. And this is what they did. This is what they did in the 90s. This is what they did in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But is this just a stopgap measure? Where and what does it imply for Australia and Chile and Brazil and other countries that seriously rely on China to support their economies when we know that India is not a viable next place to go in terms of a demographically attractive country that needs to come out of the third world era in terms of its own infrastructure, but India's not there yet. So what are the implications for the countries that have relied on China for decades now, and where does China really want to be spending its money today?
So the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is a good indicator of where they're going. And I think what they're trying to do is essentially connect resources to productive capacity to markets. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be tightly integrated with the Belt and Road Initiative, which has a maritime component, it has a landward component, and it has a digital component. And so the idea is essentially to connect these countries that have the resources to the productive capacity of China, to offload some of that productive capacity, particularly in low value added products in those countries, and create basically an economic sphere of influence mm-hmm. that is paired with a social and political system that they are comfortable with. And so what's happening is, because of what America is doing in terms of resetting the way it deals with China, and it's doing so along with its allies and partners, essentially the democracies are beginning to come together like they did during the Cold War, and they were very tightly integrated. In fact, there was just a report talking about this idea of a technology D10, right? The democracies 10 coming together for artificial intelligence, 5G. It was in there's a report coming out that talks about this, and has to do with 5G and security. That's going to be the democracies. What China has in mind is the emergent market economies and the authoritarian regimes. So we're talking about Middle East, we're talking about Africa, talking about Latin America, we're talking about Central Asia, and the four horsemen: Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. So that is what they have in mind. And so this idea of a digital currency goes right along with half the undersea cables that Huawei has laid, with the digital Silk Road, the building of 5G networks, the ability to control the populations using technology that Silicon Valley built. All of this is meant to have this arrangement where China's at the core, and it provides the capital via the renminbi, which will be part. So it is a closed financial system, but it's extending that firewall for that financial mm-hmm. system to the countries in its orbit. It did so in the beginning through bilateral currency exchanges, which it also did with democracies. Those are going to go away. So those currency exchanges are going to exist, and most likely what I'm guessing with the introduction of a digital currency is that they're going to try to basically create this greater firewall with a digital currency that allows this kind of economic activity in the way that they've thought about it, which is the people in charge stay in charge and everybody else are subjects.
Well, it sounds like they're going after places where they can take control effectively.
Right.
It truly sounds like you're talking about, well, the word you used before. This is a bifurcated type of future that's being envisioned between the developed countries and the less developed countries. It was fascinating to me that Australia went so far as to head a coalition of countries demanding an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, given that China has done so very much for Australia. But I think their first recession in 30 years, and the fact that there's so much debt that's been built up, and some of the buildings that the Chinese have come in and built are flammable. And so I visited Australia for some time. I think they're realizing that it was a deal that wasn't necessarily made with their ally.